Isaiah chapter 46, reading verses 1 down to 10. Isaiah chapter 46, verses 1 to 10. Gods of Babylon, Bel bows down, Nebo stoops low, their idols are borne by beasts of burden. The images that are carried about are burdensome, a burden for the weary. They stoop and bow down together, unable to rescue the burden. They themselves go off into captivity. Listen to me, O house of Jacob, all you who remain of the house of Israel, you whom I have upheld since you were conceived, and have carried since your birth. Even to your old age and gray hairs, I am he. I am he who will sustain you. I have made you, and I will carry you. I will sustain you, and I will rescue you. To whom will you compare me or count me equal? To whom will you liken me that we may be compared? Some pour out gold from their bags and weigh out silver on the scales. They hire a goldsmith to make it into a god, and they bow down and worship it. They lift it to their shoulders and carry it. They set it up in its place, and there it stands. From that spot it cannot move. The one cries out to it, it does not answer. It cannot save him from his troubles. Remember this, fix it in mind. Take it to heart, you rebels. Remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. May God bless this reading from his word.
As we are all aware, this is the week of what we call Remembrance Day. And as Wes reminded us at the Lord's Supper, that for us as Christians, remembering Jesus and the cross is the most important thing and the most important idea that we have. I find as I'm getting older, remembering is sometimes becoming more and more of a challenge. I don't know about you, but I find that there are things that Diana may have said to me just even earlier in the day, and she'll say, "Did you remember to?" And I'm like, "Oh, I didn't." We understand that memory is part of the function of our brains, and sometimes our brains are not really functioning that well. Yet there are things that are so important for us to remember that we need to find ways to keep them in the front of our thinking. That's why many of us are wearing poppies today, right? Because we're remembering Remembrance Day. But yet, what we want to talk about this morning comes out of this passage from Isaiah. And it's the idea of remembering God. Because of all the things that we need to keep in mind, that God is foremost and first. Now, the background for this passage, and we always like to do the background, really is set by the first verse, where Isaiah mentions the gods of Babylon, or at least a couple of them. He gives us the Jewish or Hebrew names for them. First one he mentions is Bel. Bel was known by the Babylonians as Marduk. And many scholars think that this is something that has come, and you look at the name Bel, that this is associated with the term Baal, which is the god back in Palestine that was the chief deity, was the god of fertility, as well as the god of the weather, the storm, the rain. That ultimately in the thinking of the Baal worshippers, the Marduk worshippers, that he would be the chief, most important god. He has a son who is known as Nebo. When you see the name Nebo in the text, you might think about Mount Nebo, which is the place where Moses went to before Israel crossed the Jordan River. But Nebo was the Babylonian god of learning and writing. And so Isaiah begins this chapter talking about both Bel and Nebo, these idols of Babylon. But he points out the fact that the thing about idols is that these are statues of some form, physical things that have been shaped, whether of wood or stone or precious metal. He's going to talk about gold and silver being used to create the idols in a minute. But the thing is, they're not mobile. They just stand or lay wherever they've been put. There's kind of an irony here as he speaks about them being carried around by beasts of burden, in that they have, you think about it, the idol worshippers, the beasts that carry the idols, and the idols themselves all stoop and bow down together. The physical beings, the animals, and the idol worshippers get exhausted. The idols just stay there. But kind of the tragedy is that the idols are powerless. They're unable to help. They can't even move themselves around. How could they help a person that's crying out to them for help? And so even the idea that Isaiah mentions is that the idols would be carried into captivity along with the people, because they can't prevent another nation from conquering the nation that worships them. It's kind of an exercise in futility. And they're simply the work of a craftsman. And, I've talked about some of the other passages about idolatry in the Old Testament. And there's one that just, about the man who takes a log and he cuts it in half, and one half he burns in the fire, and the other half he carves into an idol and says, "You are my God. You made me." Well, no. He made the God. It's not really a God, despite the fact that he may worship and that he may serve it. And so we have just this very pathetic image that he mentions down in verse 7. They lift it to their shoulders and carry it. They set it up in its place. There it stands. From that spot, it cannot move. Though one cries out to it, it does not answer. It cannot save him from his troubles. I think we look at something like that and we kind of scratch our heads and we think, don't you think these people would catch on sooner or later? How can they keep worshiping these idols for generation after generation, for literally century after century? And so it is in this context that Isaiah issues this call to remember. In verse 8 he says, "Remember this." Well, what is that? To remember the former things, those of long ago, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But to remember the things he's just been talking about. Remember the futility and the emptiness and the vainness of these idols. Remember what it is to try to worship and serve a false god. And now think back to the God that Israel has been serving for centuries. To this, as he calls it, that of long ago. To remember who God is, what he is, and what he has done. So, through this chapter, Isaiah gives some reminders here about this God. And I just look at the things that he says about God here. He has upheld you since you were conceived. He has carried you since birth. He will sustain you even to your old age and gray hair. He made you. He will carry you. He will sustain. Now notice that instead of referring to the past, now he's referring to the present and future. He will rescue you. Compare this with the the futility of the false gods that Babylon serves. To think about the God who created Israel as a nation, who brought them out of Egyptian slavery, established them in the promised land, who has blessed them and served them and upheld them. And they have responded to that by forgetting him. Well, you think, okay, well, how could they forget him? Well, have they totally forgotten him? One of the things that when we talk about the message of the prophets in the Old Testament, that I think we kind of need to keep in mind is that it isn't that Israel has completely forgotten God. It's that they have allowed other things to crowd him out. They may still be doing lip service to God. They may still be offering sacrifices. There's a tokenism about this. But in a practical reality, they have forgotten him. I always think of the idea that human beings often try to reduce God to something that, it's like God in a building, God, in a church building. And some of you may remember that there was an illustration came out that was circulating many years ago about a little boy that goes into the store and asks the guy, says, I want God in a box. And you think about how that kind of fits into a lot of people, that I want this token presence of God so that I have the comfort of feeling like he's close to me and he's there to do what I want when it's convenient for me, but he's not going to make any demands on me. And certainly don't ask me to make any kind of a commitment or do anything. And so to this people, Isaiah, speaking for God, calls them, and look at these terms, rebels. Kind of a strong word, isn't it? Rebels? Stubborn-hearted? Says you're far from righteousness. These last two are in the three verses that follow what we read just a few minutes ago. But it's that reminder that Israel, the people of God's, quote, chosen people, have reached the point that their worship and service of him has become so token that in effect they have forgotten him. He's no longer really significant or important in that they don't allow him to have any kind of a voice or a real presence in their life. They just go through the motions and the rituals and the routines. But then, as you notice when you look at the Old Testament, you realize that they're also serving Baal. I mean, they see him as the local god there in Palestine who's responsible for fertility, so they need him for the crops. And his consort, Asherah. And you think, okay, in the world of the 21st century, for us as Christians, what are the voices, what are the gods that are calling to us to say, oh, don't worry about the real God. Your prosperity is here. Your welfare is here. Your future is here. And where is God? How many of us have exchanged God for the gold and silver that Isaiah spoke of? The message of Isaiah 46 is to go with the Ten Commandments. You shall have no other gods. And so God says, you may have noticed, these verses kind of stand out, don't they? I am God and there is no other. Baal, Marduk, Baal, whatever you want to call them, it amounts to the same thing. Nebo, Asherah. Any of these other deities are not God's. They're not worthy of service. They're not worthy of our lives. I alone am God. I am God. There's none like me. I've created you. I gave you life. I will sustain you. I will protect you. I will deliver you. You know, when you cry out to God, I will be there. I won't be like that piece of wood or stone or gold or silver that just kind of sits there blankly and dumbly, because that's all it can do. It's a creation of human beings' hands. But it's nothing. It may be beautiful, but it's voiceless and powerless. I make known. This is one of those verses that I just love. And I don't know if you have a verse like this that kind of plays in your mind when you look at the Bible. I make known the end from the beginning. You know, when God created the world, the universe, when God put Adam and Eve in the garden, when he confronted them for their sin, what he told them about was that he would, from the seed of woman, bring someone into the world who would deliver a crushing defeat to Satan. Wes talked about that at the Lord's Supper. You know, it's an amazing thing to think about as we read through the Old Testament and read how God could tell his people what would happen in the future. You know, sometimes we use the word predict. God's not predicting, he's foretelling, because he knows what that future is. That's because he's God. He's outside that, what we call space and time. I'm not going to get into that, but it's to understand that as the one who created the universe, he knows what the future will be. That's why he can reveal it. It's one of the most powerful evidences for God and for the Bible. That we can read these passages that were centuries old, even at the time of Christ, that tell us in detail about what would happen with Jesus. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. That idea that we refer to as prophecy. That because he's God, he's in that position. I don't know if you're familiar or if you've read this chapter of Isaiah very often, but it's one that you really need to sit down and read from time to time, because it kind of brings us to confront the real concept of God, not what people worship and create, not what people try to reduce him to that little God in a box type of thing, but to understand the God of the creation, the God of the universe, the God of all time, God of all power, all knowledge, has spoken and acted in human history. So when we talk about remembering God, it's not because there's a danger that we will, quote, forget him. And once it is the danger that we will reduce him to insignificance in our lives. And God says, my purpose will stand. It will be here. And so remember God. It's not that we forget totally, but we willingly ignore and turn away from him. We allow competing calls for attention and service. We allow things to interfere with our response to our Creator. Forgetting God is losing sight of our one true God. Not giving him the honor and the place. You know, you can think about different passages in the Bible. I was thinking about, putting them all together. I thought, well, no, that would take us too long. But, just like Ecclesiastes, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days draw near. The idea of keeping God at the front is really what the idea is.